All right. Hello again, everybody. With us on this session, I have the amazing Jamie Metzl with us. He's going to be talking about the coronavirus pandemic, obviously, and what this might mean for us moving forwards. So Jamie is a technology and healthcare futurist and a geopolitical expert, novelist, entrepreneur, media commentator, and of course, a member of Singularity University's exponential medicine faculty. He's also a member of the World Health Organization's International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and the author of Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity, which is coming out in April 7th. Great thing to read if you happen to still be quarantined at home. You can always learn more at jamiemetzl.com, and that's Metzl, Metzl.com. Jamie, thanks for having us. It's off to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam. And thank you and the amazing people at Singularity for putting this on. I know a lot of people are afraid. There's a lot of bad information, misinformation out there, and I've really just been loving everything. So kudos to you and to everybody who's here, because this is a really, really trying time, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. And we all need to share information, to share knowledge, to share sanity, and to really just work together to get through this. And we will. So my original topic, as some of you may have seen from the earlier agenda, was talking about how the tools of the genetics revolution can be used to address this crisis. I've written my book, Hacking Darwin, which goes deeply into a lot of these issues. But as I was listening yesterday to some people who I really love and respect, Daniel Kraft, Ray McCauley, and others, I felt pretty confident that those topics were well covered. And so rather than having just a slightly different angle on what we've discussed these last, certainly over the last 36 hours, what I wanted to do was do something a little bit different. As Adam said, I have two pieces of my background. One is in the genetics and biotech world. But I also have a national security geopolitics background. I was on the National Security Council, the State Department, Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I think what we're seeing today is really a convergence of those two different worlds, the world of science and biology, and increasingly the world of geopolitics. And as this crisis plays out over the coming months and more than months, the geopolitical implications of what's happening are going to become much, much greater. I think it's really important that we start thinking about what those may be. And we really have to reflect deeply about what is the nature of this moment. For probably most of the people on this call remember where we were 19 years ago in 2001, when the Twin Towers were hit. And that is our frame of reference. But it's my contention that this isn't really a 2001 moment. This is something much bigger. I think of this as a 1941 moment. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by that, first on a personal level, and then on a geopolitical level. My father was born in 1938 in a little village in Austria, and his parents grew up in this little village, and that was their world. And they weren't following anything with geopolitics, but then things started happening. I'm sorry, 1935. I don't want to make my dad any younger. Crazy things started happening. And when my dad was 3, the Nazi trucks came to this little village. Everybody was thrown on the trucks, and they were sent first to the Vienna ghetto, where they escaped and survived. And then after the war, after being displaced persons for 10 years, they came to the United States and had a totally new life. So there had been between 1939 and 1938, 39, and 1948, when they came to the United States, the world had been reshuffled and they entered a new life. And we are having that kind of moment. And so when I think about 1941, everybody knows that 1941, the war had already started. But that in 1941, certainly at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, things started getting very, very serious. And it wasn't until 1945 that the war was over. So 1941, it was the thick of it. Nobody knew what the outcome of the war was going to be. Everybody was terrified. The United States in 41, and certainly for most of 1942, was losing the war, as were the Allies. But even in the height of those darkest of times, planning began imagining what the world would look like when they got through that cataclysm. It was 1941 that President Roosevelt gave his famous Four Freedoms speech. 1941 that the Atlantic Charter was agreed to, that really set out the vision for what the post-war international order would look like. And basically all of our lives exist within that order, and we are the beneficiaries of that process. So that's how I really would like for us, at least for this moment, to think about this moment. And when I think about these transitional times, there's a quote that I like to use by the Italian communist theorist Antonio Gramsci, written in the 1930s, which is, the old world is dying, the new world has not yet emerged, and in the twilight rise up monsters. So let me kind of take the three pieces of that sentence, each, let's call them chapters in this conversation. First, the old world is dying. The old world of the post-war international order, this world that we've all grown up with, was dying well before this particular coronavirus crisis began. And we've seen it breaking down. We've seen the disintegration of global norms and institutions. We've seen what I call the de-universalization of values. There was a time when we all believed that the arc of history bent towards justice, when we were working toward the realization of universal concepts of human rights and international law. We even had this concept that never really made sense about the end of history, but it was this idea that there was a directional movement. And we've also seen a renationalization of the world, because the post-World War II planners, if they had done a diagnosis of what were the key problems that had led to the war, they would have said it was excessive sovereignty, World War I, and excessive nationalism, World War II. And so the world that they tried to create was a world that shared sovereignty and curbed nationalism. And so before we were talking about foreign viruses and closing down borders, we've seen, and certainly here in the United States with the Trump presidency, Boris Johnson, Hungary, Turkey, many places around the world, we've seen a renationalization of the world. So learning the exact opposite lessons of these great post-war international planners. And all of these institutions that were set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, all of these organizations have been starved in the context of this renationalization. And that's one of the reasons why these big challenges, not just pandemic preparedness, but climate change, oceans, thinking about the future of artificial general intelligence, autonomous killer AI, all of those things can't be sufficiently addressed because we haven't laid the foundations for those kinds of processes. And that all sounds worrying, and it is. But there are some very positive pieces of this globalization story that we also need to be mindful of. One of the reasons why this pandemic can travel so quickly is that we have 7.5 billion humans on this earth. 100 years ago, at the time of the Spanish flu, we only had 2 billion people. But of those 2 billion people, only 20% of them were literate. So when we thought about what is the brain pool for solving the problems in front of us, at most, that was 400 million people. Now we have 7.5 billion people. From a viral perspective, we have 7.5 billion potential hosts. We have an 85% literacy rate, and that means that we have about 6.5 billion people who can be part of this fight, part of this effort to fix what needs to be fixed. We're connected to each other. In In our ancestors, it took thousands of years. When one civilization figured out the recipe for copper or bronze or iron, it maybe took thousands of years for that knowledge to transfer. Now we're seeing it in efforts to try to find a vaccine for this pandemic. The pandemic moves at the speed of globalization, but the response also moves at the speed of globalization. And we're seeing a super convergence of all of these technologies. So the tools that we are bringing to this fight are greater than anything that our ancestors could possibly have imagined. Actually, these tools are what our ancestors would have attributed to the gods. And that's what the biotech revolution is about. We now have basically the capability to read, write, and hack the code of life. And that is the essence of this moment. But there's a mismatch between this bottom-up energy and this bottom-up connectivity that I think we're all now feeling, and the failure of our top-down institutions. So that's really, when we talk about the old world is dying, we're seeing it. We're having these great challenges, and the systems that we have aren't up to the task of addressing them, even though there are many, many points of light, including communities like this. So I'm going to flip the other two clauses of the sentence, and I'll go to the third one. In the twilight, rise up monsters. We're feeling those monsters now. I'm in New York City. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear everywhere. There are places where people's liberty is being compromised. In some ways, we're going to have to give up temporarily some of our liberty, but we need to be very, very careful, because states that take these kinds of powers don't often give them back. And we need to be careful about where this is going. You know, certainly here in the United States, there are optimistic assessments of how long this is going to last. I've heard a month, 2 months, summer. I hope that that's the case, but there's a real chance that this waxes and wanes, and we're living very, very different lives until there's a vaccine. And you know, maybe we can get that in a year. But from the estimates that I've seen, I think an 18-month for widespread vaccination is much more likely. And in that time, there are a lot of things, unexpected things, that I think can and maybe will happen. I mean, certainly here in the United States, first people were talking about an economic slowdown and then a recession, and now there's very real talk of a depression. But that's the least of it. I mean, certainly there'll be issues with our healthcare systems, and those are the predictable things. But there are a lot of second and third order effects that we're going to see, cascades of what happens with these fundamental transformations. I think we're likely, I mean, right now, poorer parts of the world, Africa and South Asia, haven't been particularly hard hit. When they are, which I hope they're not, but if and when they are, we may see significant refugee or migrant flows. We may see fragile states collapsing. We may see multilateral organizations like the European Union unable to support the strain of what's going on. We can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but this isn't just a thing where people are going to feel a little poorer and our hospitals are going to be strained and somehow we'll muddle through. Those things may be true, but there will be very, very significant second and third order effects. And our democracies, as I mentioned, are going to be challenged. And there may be types of soft coups, even here in the United States, where there were already problems with our last election. If people are not comfortable going to the polls, is there a possibility of manipulation? Will people take advantage if people aren't comfortable going out into the street? We don't know that, but that's why it's so dangerous to go into a crisis like this with such low levels of trust in government. I mean, imagine what had happened if the current global configuration of leaders had been in place in 1941. I think there's a very real chance we could have lost the war and we would be living in a very, very, very different world. And there are actors who are going to take advantage of what's happening. And certainly We don't know what's going to happen with Russia, with North Korea. But these kinds of moments are moments of opportunity for people who have all kinds of desires and aspirations that may be very different from ours. And so we don't know how this is going to play out. But one thing that's, for me, absolutely clear is it's not just that we're going to go through this and then the world is going to snap back to be exactly like it was before this crisis happened. We are going to come out of this like my father's experience in the Second World War. We're going to come out of this into a different world. And so that leads me to chapter 3, which is the new world has not yet emerged, but we can see parts of that new world from here. And what does it look like? One is, I think we're going to see, and certainly people in the Singularity community, we've been talking about this for many years, but the rapid virtualization of life. We're all having this event that we're doing it virtually, and it's amazing. But here, just down the street from where we are now, our hospitals are gearing up for a mass influx of patients. We've seen from China that our frontline healthcare workers are likely to be compromised relatively quickly. And I don't that we have our full complement of doctors and nurses, but based on the Chinese experience, they're going to be compromised relatively quickly. So what are we going to do? We're going to have to virtualize. Companies like Amazon and Amazon's trying to recruit Walmart and others are going cashierless. Robotic manufacturing, all these things that we've seen as long-term trends are going to very, very rapidly speed up in this age of virtualization. I actually have a piece coming out later tonight on CNN.com about virtualization and how to think about it in our response. And I'll send that around to everybody through Adam later tonight. And we're going to see this greater decentralization. I mean, that's what we're seeing in the European Union. Since Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, there was this grand vision that we were going to come together in ever closer union. And now these barriers and boundaries are going up. And that's going to be a very, very different world. Things aren't just going to rapidly snap back to where things were. But there's also a really important question. This is the essence of my remarks. And that is, now is 1941. Now is the time when we need to think about what we would like the world to be in. If this is 1941, what's the world that we want to start thinking about and planning for now, and then start building when this clears and when we're in the equivalent of 1945. And that's on a personal level. And I've been writing that our physical social distancing is going to require virtual emotional closening. And that's really important. I think we're all starting to do that, but we're going to have to do it way, way more. And in my CNN article, I have some 7 recommendations for how to do this. And we're going to need to think about real global norms. I mean, we can all imagine a better world that could have responded to this crisis, where there was a global surveillance system, when there were triggers, that when there were the first indications of what was happening in Wuhan, through the surveillance system, there was a international, perhaps WHO-led emergency team that immediately went there with powers, that was able to garner a significant response. We would be in a different world. And so we're going to need to realize the vision of, or maybe of our grandparents, of what coming together on a national and international level might look like. But it is not 1941 in that we don't have a world where you can have some really smart, small number of people coming together with planning. As a matter of fact, earlier today, I was running in Central Park. I ran into a friend of mine who works at the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York. And I was making this point. And if you just go to one of the conference rooms in CFR, they have these pictures of all these white guys. And it was the 1940s equivalent of the committee who saved the world. They saved the world and rebuilt the world. People like Dean Acheson and others. But we don't have them now. We don't have a global structure that allows a small number of people to make those kinds of decisions. And if we did, we don't trust most of those people to make those decisions for the benefit of everywhere. And so if this is 1941, we need to think differently about how this planning process begins. We need to have some kind of bottom up. We are in a world where government still matters, the UN still matters, but we need something very, very meaningful from the bottom up. We, all of us, need to reinvigorate a global system that can begin to engage people inclusively across differences, across countries, because we're all humans, we're all in this together. We need to have processes that can turn global inclusive dialogues into norms and then regulations and structures. But to do that, we're going to have, in many ways, an open global constitutional process, lower C constitutional. And it has to start somewhere. It has to start with an articulation of virtual principles. It has to start with some type of organizational effort, the kind of the equivalent of a constitutional convention, because nobody is going to solve this for us. I mean, that's what we're learning so painfully here in the United States, that the government isn't doing it. And the government and our governments, and some are better intentioned than others, aren't able to come together to solve this problem. So we need to come together both to force our governments to play a greater role, not just addressing this crisis, because as we address this crisis, there are 10 other crises that we're going to have over the coming decades, where we're going to say, well, what were you doing? Why weren't you paying attention to whatever it is? Climate change, oceans, autonomous killer robots, AGI, whatever that is. And so now is the time when we need to be focusing on those issues, but we need to be doing it collectively, and we need to have this global groundswell create the kind of institutions that we need to do this wisely. And we need to reinvigorate something like the United Nations. And given that we have a United Nations, we may as well use that. But the states have abandoned the United Nations. So we need to have a body that's looking at these big systemic issues, that's bringing people together, that's finding consensus, that's creating national and global best practices. And that brings me back to this moment, because our lives are changing and about to change in a very significant way. But the thing that we called normal, our old normal, was just the new normal for people who are older than us. And this new normal that is so shocking for all of us is just the normal of future generations. I don't mean future generations 50 years from now. I mean people who are born 5 years from now. And so this is our St. Crispin's Day. This is our moment to really come together, and structures like this. I mean, we are having this virtual global meeting. I see all the comments coming in from all around the world. We are a new form of polity, and we don't want to be exclusive. We want to be inclusive, but we need to be thinking differently about what's coming. We need to be dreaming about the world that's going to follow this crisis, because this is going to pass, and this is our moment to come together. All right, Adam, that's it.
If only my fingers could move faster. Thanks for that. Usually I'm up here just like I can tell when the last slide is, and I'm ready to come back online. This
yeah,
one,
exactly. Yeah. No, that's with me.
That was impressive, man. Thanks for piecing that together. I've been really enjoying having conversations with people about all these different parallels from times in the past when we faced crises, very, very serious situations. But at the same time, we've come out the other side stronger, more innovative. I think in a lot of cases, more connected, hopefully. So really appreciate all your thoughts there. Let me open up the questions and answers and see what we've got in here. So the one at the top is, in the future, after all COVID issues are gone, which, as you said, who knows how long that's going to be, whether this is our new normal or if we get past it from a disease standpoint. What are some things that we can do to get back the liberty that governments may or may not have taken along the way?
Yeah, it's such an essential question. First, we need to be articulating principles now. That people are so afraid that we can't just say, all right, government gets all the authorities. And we saw that after 9/11. People were so afraid that they would sign anything. And certainly our legislators signed anything. And that doesn't mean our governments are going to need special authorities to face this, but we need to be articulating now what our principles are. And we need to be building sunset clauses into the legislation because it's the nature of governments to not take back. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to change. We must have global surveillance mechanisms, certainly for deadly pathogens to keep us safe. But that's the thing is we need to be, it's the same point, we need to be articulating our long-term vision now so that we can be evaluating everything against that standard.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see just how much more people are talking about principles these days. And I speak from somebody that's been in the United States, but I'd be curious if that's happening globally as well as the place that we need to all start from. All right, Silvana asks, we have the Agenda 2030 from the United Nations. Is this a valid framework to consider for all nations to adopt? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am. I think it's great. That's a piece of it. I mean, I was in Davos earlier this year, which now just seems ridiculous in light of where the world is. And everybody had their Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals pin. And so we've had a lot of global problem-solving theater. And we have principles. I mean, all those principles are the right principles. What we don't have are meaningful enough structures to guide their realization. And we've seen that with climate change, for example. We couldn't get some kind of international agreement. The countries couldn't come together. Then they essentially meant, all right, well, everybody do your best. And then the people, and even those of us in wealthier countries, it's one thing, but people in the Maldives, in Bangladesh, I mean, those people are going to lose their homes and don't even have really a say in this process. So I think we have enough. The principles are pretty good. What we need to invest in is how do we build structures that can realize those principles? And certainly, as I said, one of our mechanisms for doing that is holding our governments accountable. Here in the United States, we're having an election. That's what this election is about. But we also need to recognize that there's just a new locus of power, and it's us. We're not organized. And so it's one thing for us to have video conferences, and that's a first step. We need to organize into something that translates into power, because that's the language, and we have the numbers, but we're disorganized, and that's the challenge for us.
You mentioned, you said two things that stood out to me. One is that no one is going to solve this for us. And then you also said that we need to be thinking differently about what's coming. Any initial ideas that you have around what that might look like?
Oh, very, very much so. So one is, I would love for us to just do the equivalent of a statement of principles and beginning to set up processes for meaningful global deliberation. I mean, it just seems kind of like a crazy thing, just like it was crazy for these colonists to say, all right, we have these principles. They're different from the principles that we've been governed by in the past. And then we're going to build institutions to realize those principles. I mean, that's why you're sitting in London and you say like, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. And we know what happens here and elsewhere. So I think that's what it is. I mean, that all these things are being done in our name, and we have to find a new way. There's, like I was saying before, there's just a mismatch between these global problems and the structure of national politics. And it's a big thing to solve for, but we're having this conversation. I mean, this is really intimate with people all around the world. And the number of people who can just be part of this conversation, it's unprecedented. You couldn't have done this in the beginning of the industrial age or even the nuclear age. We now have this tool, and this is a constitutional moment, and they don't happen very often.
Yeah, well, you're getting a lot. You're building a lot of fans here in the chat. I'm not sure if you have it open, but I think you're going to get a lot of connection requests after this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just such a great reminder that so many of the major things that have happened in the world have started off from small groups of people.
So I write about this in my book. The anti-slavery movement in the UK in the 18th century, it was literally 15 people in somebody's living room in Cambridge. I mean, it's nothing. And these things have to start, and all things that start seem crazy and impossible, but some of them make it. And this just feels like one of those moments. And I don't have the answer of exactly how to do it. If it was easy, it probably would have been done. But I don't think there's been this kind of motivation and this kind of capacity around the world. And like I said, this exact event is an example of a start. And then we could say, all right, well, what's a next small step that we can take out of this? For example, we may say, well, what are kind of the core principles that we think should guide global responses to global challenges? Just making a set of that. And then the next step could be, all right, what's the basic consultative process so that we would feel there would be an inclusive global voice with all of its diversity that could make just recommendations, even if it's recommendations to nobody, recommend. And I think it's like we can't do it all at once, but maybe it's like brick by brick, we can build this wall.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that if there is a, excuse me, if there's like a new global citizens group that comes out of this that really rallies behind it and attempts to go above and beyond borders and governments and companies and all those things, in the way that pretty much everybody here has talked about is how do we bring everybody together and move forward.
And my feeling is let's do it for this crisis. I mean, we're in the middle of a crisis where we need this. Let's figure out, we should think about the big picture, but let's figure out how do we do it for this crisis? How do we use the energy of this group and translate that into one next step? Because there are a lot of lessons that keep being learned in different countries. Here, I'm in New York, everybody's scrambling. And the big question is, are we more like South Korea or are we more like Italy? And the answer is we are more like Italy. So people are looking at Italy to say, well, what are the lessons learned there? And this is going to happen as this, we're globalized. So this, depending on the nature of the virus and its how it relates to heat and all sorts of things, this is probably going to jump around the world. And we're going to need to systematize a lot of the lessons that we're learning here, because there are countries that are now thinking like, hey, we made it. We don't have to worry about this. And 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, it's all going to hit. And they're not going to have time to wade through, however many videos. And so I just think that we can take little steps and then use those little steps, imagine the big picture, but learn by doing.
Yeah. Well, Jamie, that is the end of our time today. Thank you so much for being here. I think that we're going to do a follow-on with you here in a couple of weeks when your book is closer to coming out. So we'll definitely look forward to that. But thank you so much for your time today.
Really my pleasure.
All right. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
All right. Well, if you felt motivated and empowered by that conversation, you are definitely in the right place here at Singularity University. Those are the types of conversations we'd love to have and foster. And then, of course, we're here for you to go and take those next steps. So for anybody that is thinking like, I'm going to go and start that citizens group, or I'm going to go and do this, build the principles or make the processes or whatever it is, we want to hear from you. Get in touch with us, su.org. You can email me directly, adam.hoffman@su.org. Happy to help out and get you connected. And also just wanted to share something really quick before we go to the next session. If you enjoyed that topic and want to go deeper on these things, We are co-hosting. We've partnered with EXO and XPRIZE to go more in depth. So this isn't COVID-19 related. Obviously, what's happening, COVID-19 has an implication on the future, but we wanted to bring you all the COVID-19 content completely free, open, everything. But if you want to go deeper into these topics like business, government, all that type of stuff, join us. You got this URL here, exoworld.live/su. You can get in and get registered. That is coming up in the next month or so, and we would love to have you along for our next conversation. We'll have more experts and faculty members, some of which you've seen today, going much deeper and having some workshops and more interactive stuff going on as well. So hope to see you there. All right. And with that, we are going to move on to the next session. We're going to be talking about AI. So I will see you all shortly.